When we consider what is power, we need to move beyond worldly definitions that seem to relate to position and wealth. And we need to go to the higher dimension if we're on a spiritual path, the dimension of sovereignty. Power is the ability to make happen what you want to happen and prevent from happening that which you decide not to happen. It's a lot to do with choice. If we have the freedom to choose what we are, who we are, where we are, when we're doing what we're doing, the environment, what imposes upon us, all of these things, this indicates power. And there comes a time in life, I mean, at the very beginning, you're trying to get some power back from your parents, and you do this by learning skills and becoming capable in the sense the magician has the ability to manipulate the physical world. And that leads to positions of power and wealth eventually, if you're a competent person. But there comes a time a little bit later than that, probably later in life for most people, when it becomes really clear that that definition of power measured by wealth and position is false. It's just so shallow that it represents falseness. It's not real. It just lasts a very short period of time indeed, and inevitably depends upon a higher power. This is not true of sovereignty. Sovereignty is where we are what we choose to be, and there's no question about it. This cannot be achieved with worldly means alone. It's very likely that the mirror reflection of this inner sovereignty will manifest in outer ways, and it may well be that you have position, and it may well be that your wealth is enough to get the job done. But these are tools. They're not essential. The essence of power is sovereignty, where you're free from anybody else who's pulling your strings like a marionette. Now, how do we attain that power, which is the true power of the emperor? When we look at the tarot cards, that representation of the emperor, it's not a king. It's an emperor, ruling kings. So if we think of kings as having worldly power, an emperor is above all of that, can control kings. In other words, can control the unfolding of politics and reality itself. Now, if we're to attain that level of mastery over everything, including everyone, true sovereignty requires that, of course, then we have to deepen our sense of what is the case spiritually. Our spiritual philosophy needs to be very clear indeed. So we start our quest in terms of developing the archetypal wisdom of the emperor by studying spiritual philosophy. What do we believe is true? This is such a subtle question, because since birth we have been fed information, opinions, statements that just are not true. Some of these were knowingly delivered to us. In other words, people were lying in order to get a rise out of us, like Santa Claus is what parents want, because parents want to see their children excited. That gives the parents a buzz. And then later they disappoint them by telling them that Santa Claus doesn't exist. So there's that kind of white lie, you could call it, if such a thing exists, which I doubt. So that kind of lying process also applies when people just don't know what they're saying, but they tell you as though they do, which is most of the education systems. In the school system, you get that kind of thing from teachers. They tell you that this is the case, and it really isn't. You know, even on the level where when I was studying physics at school, I was told that light is this, and light behaves like that. And it had been known for almost 100 years that that is not the case, that nobody actually knows whether light is a particle or a wave, but my teachers did, and they told me wrongly, and so on. And then you get marketing people and politicians. You're given this statement about the nature of reality, and it's false. So the first thing we have to do is to free ourselves from such falseness in order to be free to decide for ourselves what is true. Because unless you know that, then you're subject to somebody else's definitions about what is true, and you can't be who you are, because mostly, almost universally, it's false. So this does not exclude major works of Scripture. Major works of Scripture are actually the worst examples of where we have been fed lies and ignorance and so on for political purposes, including controlling our behavior, much like a parent tells lies to a child to control its behavior. So this is where we're coming from, and there are no exceptions to this. We're all brainwashed, and we have to come out of that darkness of intentional brainwashing in order to get a glimmer of the light of truth. Most people don't at all. They really don't do this at all. They know that everything's wrong. They're not stupid. Everything clearly is wrong, but they don't go far enough to find out what might be right. However, if they do move in that direction, they almost certainly get scooped up by religiosity and religious teachings and all that nonsense as well. Now, the thing is about religious teachings is that within that there are glimmers of truth. So we can't just dismiss them and not go there, because the truth can be found, but it's like finding one tree in a forest. And however switched on you are to the existence of the falseness of religious teachings and political teachings and parental teachings, it's not enough just to be switched on to the consciousness that it's false. You have to actually work out what might be true instead. And so you really need to get into the philosophy behind all of this and the explanations that give rise to the philosophy. And we come about this question from the starting point of what began maybe 2,500 years ago, is the determination that good and bad exist, and that spiritual is good and material is bad in the extreme. And that was a choice made by the collective of humanity some time ago. It didn't have to be that way, that spirituality is good and materiality is bad. And you don't even get that in the East, in India and Bali in particular, where it's just all mixed up. Spirituality is not different from materiality at all. It's just an underlying philosophy, a clue to devotion, like that kind of thing. Is a part of materiality. So the idea of having sovereignty over the material world is nonsense, unless you have sovereignty over the spiritual world. So how do we know what is true? How do we understand which teachings we can follow and which teachings are to be rejected? And it's a very startling discovery that you eventually get to go through, where you realize that there isn't, truth doesn't exist. There isn't a philosophy that applies across the board, and we have to make it up for ourselves. We have to perceive things in the way that seems to align with the essence of who we are. In other words, soul consciousness. So some of us as souls have one way of seeing the world, some of us have a different way. And on that level of soul, we have a sense of what is true, as long as we put the phrase "for us" after it, so we can find out what is true for us on the level of soul. But the idea that that applies to every soul is false. The idea that applies to every ego is nonsense. including our own. So to be free of the brainwashing that turns us into puppets, we have to find a spiritual philosophy where there is none except what we create for ourselves. And the eventual understanding is that the Emperor card squares the circle between power and freedom. Power and freedom are almost impossible to reconcile. You give up one to claim the other. That's food for thought. But here's the Emperor, where sovereignty depends upon having both of those things. The freedom to be powerful and the power to be free simultaneously. Now that's one of life's greatest mysteries. The biggest stepping stone towards resolving this mystery is found when we understand that to become powerful, we need to be free of our ideas of power vested in position and wealth and so on. To become powerful, we need to be free of those things. To become free, we need to be powerful enough to claim sovereignty, to claim our right of individuation, our individual sense of self. Now, of course, if we start to do that on the level of ego, all hell breaks loose, quite literally. I think if there is any meaning of the word hell, it is that. A world filled with egotists, all trying to shoulder the others out of their way to claim their positions of power and wealth. That's hell, and we live there. However, if you want to escape that, then you have to find that sense of certainty of being, which is a spiritual station. It's a station of faith. The faith that I, when in alignment with the soul, have the right and the ability to claim my reality the way I want it to be. This is the starting point, not the end point of your spiritual work. If you believe that it's a good idea to follow the teachings of any scripture, you're kind of missing the point. If you read the scriptures carefully, they don't check out. They really don't make sense. You need to understand them from the point of view of metaphor. This is what we're told. And yet nobody can actually explain the metaphor as being anything other than subjective. In other words, even our interpretations of spiritual scriptures are entirely dependent upon subjectivity. Whichever way you look at it, we have to make it up, and we do that from our creativity. Now, creativity is the gift of God. If we know anything about the Creator, it is that the Creator is creative. Everything else is a secondary interpretation. But to say that the Creator of all of this is creative is a truism. We know that to be true. So therefore, I think we can infer quite realistically that creativity is in alignment with the Creator's beingness. And how do we find our own creativity at the deepest essence level of spirituality? And that is only feasible when we can tune into the soul and to think of ourselves not as James who has a soul, but as the soul who is currently expressing through James in my case. So you put the I to a higher level of beingness. I am the soul incarnated into James. Now, much written work exists on the principle of reincarnation. So the soul does not only incarnate into James, but incarnates elsewhere at different times and places. And here we have a bit of a controversial message. I studied, like everyone probably listening to this video, something of reincarnation. I've understood it to come from the Hindu understanding of things, and it's taught that it's sequential in time. You live, you die, and then you're reborn later. that's the teaching as I understood it. And karma is all about making up for past life mistakes and stuff. Well, I dispute that on the basis that if time does not exist, then there can be no past life, because there's no past. Time doesn't exist. Everything is simultaneous. Now, if you don't agree with that, then we're on a different planet of existence, really, because most spiritual seekers come to the point where time doesn't exist. We're in the here and now, and that's the only reality. You can't explain that to somebody who doesn't get it intuitively, typically. So if time doesn't exist, then reincarnation cannot exist as such. And yet I think many people, certainly including myself, have really clear sense of other lives. Something's going on somewhere. So I don't dismiss reincarnation, but I don't accept it the way it is. Now, the Sufi teaching is that the soul leaves the source, incarnates once into physicality, and then returns to the source in a very long journey. So its incarnation into physicality is just once. Now, that doesn't really check out with me either, because of these memories I have or feelings I have that I exist in other space-time coordinates. So what I have kind of worked out and also read in certain texts, and my interpretation of what Walsh is saying in Conversations with God, is that this is in alignment with what I'm saying now, in that the soul leaves the source, comes down to what amounts to the astral plane, and decides then whether or not to incarnate into physical form. If it chooses to incarnate, then it bifurcates. In other words, it splits into any number, any very large number of bodies in different space-time locations. And these have their own lives and go through their own processes, learn what they want to learn, develop the qualities they want to develop, and then they die off. And as bits of the soul dies off, it merges again with those other bits that have died off on the astral plane. So on the astral plane, there exists a composite sense of soul, comprising the bits that have had their incarnations and have finished and are ready to go home, waiting for the rest of us to join, and so we can all go home to source together. Now, bit by bit by bit, the ones who are still living in physicality become fewer in number. And at the point where you're actually small in number, so there might only be a dozen or 7 or even 3 soul siblings, I call them, who are currently incarnated. As that number becomes smaller and smaller, you get to be bigger and bigger, because you're a bigger part of the whole soul in its incarnated form. And you get to tune in to the others as well. This is my experience. And so I've started to identify my soul siblings as having certain qualities and duties and abilities and so on in different time coordinates. So I like one part of me is she's a parfait, a Cathar priest lady who's a beekeeper, and she's in France at the time when the Inquisition begins. And I hide away, and I live for a month hiding from the Inquisition in this secret compartment when there's a huge tub of water and no food. And this is my favourite time because I get away from all my pressures and I can quite happily live without food for 40 days or something, as long as I've got water. So there's that part of me, and there's another part of me that's a Tibetan monk, and he's also very spiritual. But there's other bits of me that are definitely not. One part of me is, I call him Captain Jack, and he's what they call privateer, but it amounts to state piracy. You know, so he's a bit of a bully and warrior type of guy, and there are other bits of me. I've been a healer in various locations as well. So all of these parts of me have kind of lived, and mostly they've gone now. I'm down to a small number. So having that awareness of self gives me different levels of identification. I can identify myself as quite an advanced Sufi in Nuristan, somewhere near Afghanistan, and so on. And so that's why I'm attracted to this work in Sufism, and not really a mystic. I'm not that committed to doing it, but a part of me is, and there are other clues I have like that. And having this knowledge gives me some kind of spiritual authority within myself that makes it really clear that what I've been taught, like Santa Claus, I regard like the teachings of reincarnation a bit like Santa Claus, really useful, very helpful for my level of consciousness at that time. Reincarnation taught me a huge amount, but then Santa Claus isn't quite the best model for the principle of kindness and generosity. So the child is told, no, Santa Claus doesn't exist, but kindness does, generosity does, and the child grows up to understand a more subtle point. But it's like that with this reincarnation model. When you're ready for the next level of comprehension, you get to understand soul siblings. This is my take on it anyway. It's not necessarily what you want to believe. I'm just telling you what I believe. Each of us has to work out what we believe. Now, belief is a model. Belief is a mental construct. It's a map that we're using, but it's not the territory. Just because I believe something doesn't make it true. It just makes it more accessible, that I can get to the truth because I've got a model. My belief is my model of what is true. And when I check it out and it doesn't quite work, then I change my beliefs. In the same way as I draw a rough map as I'm discovering new territory and I find it's not quite right, so I rub a bit out and I put a different corrected version in there. And I've got another map. That's what my belief is. So I don't need to be told by somebody else all of the details of my beliefs. It's really useful to be told that reincarnation exists, because I thought beforehand that you just died. And then I was told, no, you come back. And that was an improvement on my original map of belief. But now I've got a more subtle map of belief, which includes soul siblings. Now, getting back to the Emperor has sovereignty. In other words, is nobody's puppet. Gets to control every aspect of his beingness. If you don't have a map, if you don't have a belief system that checks out, then you can't do that. You're not free to go anywhere if there's no map. And, well, unless you've got a tremendous sense of adventureness venturing about you, but then you can't get home unless you've got a map. So we need a map of reality, a belief system. And as we evolve and develop, we get to understand those parts of our belief system, our maps, that we need to change. That's what I'm saying. Now, you get to a level where the principle of map making, the principle of creating your beliefs becomes clear. It's just like, yeah. And you get to do it much more quickly. You can do it immediately. You can recalibrate your model of reality moment by moment. And you can look at a situation and you can see that it's very similar to what the previous one was, but it's different. And you can respond immediately. And your model making, your map making, your sense of what is in the moment becomes spontaneous. So you don't even need to follow your own historical maps. You don't need a map anymore. You've studied map making to the point where you can actually just make up your map immediately, knowing two things. First of all, that an immediacy doesn't say anything about the future. It's just for now. It's immediate. There's nothing mediating between you and your life experience. It's immediate. And therefore, it's not useful for any other time or place because things change. So you make up your map for this moment and you don't need it again. So, you know, the next moment you've got, that's the second thing that you need to understand, is that your map doesn't have any duration, but you don't need duration because you're always going to be making it up. When you have reached that level of consciousness where you don't need belief anymore, because you can make it all up moment by moment, and you're sure that you will be able to indefinitely, not just in this lifetime, indefinitely, on the level of soul. And this belief in the possibility of being able to make up belief in the future is a soul quality. So as we get closer and closer to what amounts to spontaneity and faith, if you have faith in your ability to spontaneously respond appropriately, whatever happens, then you're free and you're powerful. Now, for me, that's what the emperor means. It's nothing to do with ruling kings and having money and being important and wearing a fancy hat and a suit. Nothing to do with that at all. That may be suitable for people that still believe in Santa Claus. But when you get to the level where you know that was a stepping stone towards a higher level of consciousness, you get to this point where you understand sovereignty is spontaneous creativity in the moment, the freedom to make it all up in an evolutionary sense. So we come back to the Trinity teachings here. Freedom, evolution, creativity. They become merged eventually. The Emperor is the first in a series of three. We're going to study the Hierophant next, and then the Lovers within this triplicity of the three tarot cards making up the path of truth. So here we have the Emperor saying, look, I want to know what's true. And the truth is that there is no truth apart from what you decide to be your model of truth, which is instantaneous, spontaneous, ever-changing, has no duration. It's now. That's what living in the here and now is. And if you're not doing that, then you are subject to somebody else's pulling of strings. You'll believe something which you were told to believe in and you haven't checked out yet. Or you have checked it out and it doesn't check out and you don't know what to come up with instead because you don't have the confidence, the faith to make it all up for yourselves. That's where we come to the next point. Beyond freedom, the freedom to live in this moment spontaneously, next we learn about evolution. And then we learn about creativity. What do we do with our freedom? We evolve. What do we do with our evolution? We become creative, as indeed the Creator must be.